The main character looked down at a sign on the ground and thought that time and catastrophe had consumed the world. Moving through the ruins, he noted that disaster had destroyed both the old and new civilizations. Our guy stepped on the wreckage of what was left and muttered that even though the world had been completely ruined, there was still hope for human society. After that, he stared at the high walls humans had built to shield themselves from the destruction, but these walls had collapsed one by one. With a serious expression, Seosu, our protagonist, asked a man why all the world's technology had disappeared. The man replied, explaining that technology was now controlled by only a few, with the most powerful among them being thermal weapons. Beyond a massive wall called the Stronghold, humans struggled to survive in these post-apocalyptic times. When disaster struck, the drive for survival was all that remained. At that moment, Seosu put on a black hoodie and walked past the military, who were headed to the wilderness. He knew the soldiers were useless since they lacked combat skills, and venturing into the wilderness meant death. Ignoring them, he made his way toward the woods. In the woods, a startling bright red light caught his attention. Just then, his mind system alerted him that death breath had been detected. Suddenly, a monstrous, skull-faced creature rose from the lava of a mountain, and a swarm of experimental zombies with glowing red eyes charged toward him. A giant spider appeared as well, and the system continued to warn him about the death breath. In an instant, a massive white, monstrous grade wolf attacked Seosu, making him cough up blood. As he crouched on the ground, surrounded by experimental zombies, the system asked if he wanted to unlock his weapons. With fury building within him, Seosu commanded the system to unlock them. Following this, Seosu lay on the ground in the woods, waiting to catch a game. He knew that if he didn't manage to catch anything, he and his brother Liu would likely starve. Even a sparrow would be enough, he thought. Just then, he heard the flapping of wings and spotted a sparrow flying his way. Quickly, he prepared himself, and as the sparrow landed, Seosu sprang into action, grabbing his trap and lunging at the bird. But the sparrow noticed him and darted away at incredible speed, leaving him stunned. Still, our boy didn't give up. He swung his trap mid-air, but the sparrow was faster than Sonic and zipped past him. In one final effort, Seosu jumped to the sky like a low-budget Batman, caught the sparrow by its throat, and brought it crashing down. He quickly snapped its neck and sighed with relief that after waiting all night, he had finally caught something. Placing the sparrow over his shoulder, Seosu set off for the grocery store, intending to sell it for enough food to last a few days. However, a sudden dizziness struck him, and he clutched his head in pain. The intense headache that had plagued him since he escaped the great wolf was back, although it usually only happened at midnight. This time, though, the pain was overwhelming, and Seosu collapsed to the ground. People had dismissed his complaints as a mere headache, but Seosu knew it was much worse, like massive chaos raging inside his head. However, this time felt different. His mind was sharper than ever. Suddenly, a bright light appeared, and Seosu squinted before losing consciousness. In his subconscious, he found himself standing before a massive door, and as he pushed it open, he entered a grand palace. He looked around, wondering where he was, and walked further in. A table with an old, worn-out typewriter caught his attention, but as he approached, the pain in his head flared up again. Meanwhile, back in the woods, lightning flashed across the sky. A bald creep hid behind a tree, spying on Seosu's unconscious body. Seosu eventually regained consciousness and noticed acid rain beginning to fall, so he picked up his hunted sparrow and then stood up to leave. Just then, the bald, ugly freak lunged at him with a blade, demanding he hand over the sparrow. Seosu's quick reflexes kicked in, and he violated the ugly idiot's face with his frying pan, knocking out a tooth. The bald meathead sat on the ground, clutching his injured cheek, while Seosu resumed his journey. Suddenly, Seosu stopped as a message appeared in the sky, instructing him to give his catch to someone. He cringed because he had worked all night for this game. But turning to the bald man, he walked back. The bald dude, seeing Seosu's shadow behind him, turned and had a brain seizure, terrified to see him standing there. Seosu gave him a cold look and asked if he wanted the sparrow, so the hairless freak, still shaken, stammered that he did. Seosu then handed over the sparrow, and the man's face lit up like a child seeing gifts under a Christmas tree. A system message then informed Seosu that he had completed a mission. Back in his mind palace, a piece of paper appeared and flew to the typewriter on the table, shoving down that Seosu had been awarded the basic skill duplication scroll, making it possible to learn another person's skill. At that moment, the bald man grabbed Seosu's clothing, thanking him for his kindness. But just as Siosu received the skill, he looked back, took the sparrow, and bolted. Enraged, the man yelled after him, declaring that the world had indeed turned wicked. Before long, the acid rain stopped and the sun rose, so Siosu shielded his face from the scorching sunlight as he walked through the forest. Glancing up, he realized he had reached the entrance of the city, marked by a black gate. With that, he stepped inside, strolling along the path. However, as he walked, a group of men with faces so ugly they could serve as manure glared at him with contempt. One of the disgusting faces whispered to a bald ugly, pointing out that Siosu had caught a sizable game. Siosu noticed their hostile stares and tightened his grip on his sword's hilt, ready to strike if any dared make a move. Just then, one of the angry-looking men started toward him, but another grabbed his shoulder, advising him not to mess with Siosu, saying the guy wasn't okay upstairs. Siosu passed them and entered a small shop. Once inside, he slammed the sparrow onto the counter, demanding its worth. The merchant behind the counter screamed, telling Siosu not to bang the table so recklessly, as his glass counter was more valuable than his entire brook existence. But Siosu just scoffed. Following that, the merchant weighed the bird, announcing it was worth $700. Siosu's expression hardened as he told the fat-headed merchant that, with winter approaching, sparrows had become scarce, making the bird worth no less than $900. The merchant named Fugi crossed his arms and shook his head in refusal. So Siosu picked up the sparrow and began to leave, saying he'd sell it elsewhere. Immediately, Fuga hurried after him, saying he was open to negotiating. With a forced smile, Fuga offered the $900 Siosu requested, recalling rumors that someone from the city's stronghold management was seeking exotic animals. What the clueless merchant didn't realize was that Siosu could read his thoughts and knew exactly what he was up to. The merchant, sweating nervously, asked how much Siosu wanted for the sparrow. Siosu, with a serious expression, stated $1,200, nearly giving Fugui a heart attack. Reluctantly, Fugui counted out the bills and handed over the full amount. Siosu carefully counted the money, then noticed a black padded cotton jacket nearby and inquired about its price. The now dejected merchant replied that it was $490. Initially, Siosu decided against buying it and asked about medicine instead, which the merchant said was $620. After examining the bruise on his hand, Siosu rejected the medicine due to the high price and opted for the jacket. Hours later, he returned home to find his younger brother, Linyuan, doing homework. Linyuan looked up excitedly when he saw him, and they sat down together. Then Siosu inquired how school was going. Linyuan told him it was fine and asked when he could join Siosu on a hunting trip. Siosu explained that hunting wasn't for kids, it was dangerous, and all he wanted was for Linyuan to focus on learning physical chemistry in school, as knowledge was more valuable in their post-apocalyptic world. With that, Siosu stood up and went to prepare some soup. Linyuan instantly noticed the bruise on Siosu's hand, but Siosu dismissed it as a minor injury. When the soup was ready, Siosu handed him the offal, but Linyuan refused, insisting Siosu needed it more to help his wound heal. Siosu assured him he wasn't very hungry, but Linyuan burst into tears, saying he'd heard someone in town had died from an infected wound just 2 days prior. Seeing him cry, Siosu set down the offal and sternly told him never to cry, reminding him that the world was too cruel to believe in tears. He warned him that not eating properly would make him skinny, and in such a cruel world, weak people could be attacked and even stabbed. He added that he sent Linyuan to school because of his special abilities, not to have him scavenging in the wilderness just to survive like he does. Hearing this, Linyuan finally sat down and ate the offal, which made Siosu smile as he patted his brother's head, telling him to try on the new jacket he bought for him once he was done. Linyuan asked if Siosu had bought a jacket for himself, but Siosu just smiled, saying not to worry about him. After dinner, Siosu lay on his straw bed, reflecting on the day and wondering about the mysterious palace in his mind. He closed his eyes, and once again he found himself in his subconscious. White smoke and dark matter filled his vision, and he realized the palace had reappeared. He walked through it, studying the space. Touching the walls, he found his hand passed right through, as if it were all an illusion. He opened the palace door and stepped inside, finding the table with the typewriter at the center. As he approached, he noticed a sheet of paper on the table. It was a record of the quest he'd completed earlier that day. Examining the typewriter, he saw the words fair, positive, honest, real, friendly, and kind inscribed on the keys. He wondered if these words were telling him he had to be a good person in a world where everyone acted like devils. He muttered to himself that there was no way to be good in a world so void of morality. While this was ongoing, a hot girl with nice curves approached Seosu's hut. She opened the curtain, only to be greeted by a sharp dagger at her throat, held by Lin Yuan. The baddie was startled, fear flashing across her face, but that moment Lin Yuan recognized her as Xiao Yu and lowered his dagger. Xiao Yu asked why he was still awake, but Lin Yuan only gave her a cold stare, not bothering to respond. She then asked about Seosu, having heard he was injured. Moving into the hut, Lin Yuan replied that Seosu's hand had been pecked by a sparrow. Hearing this, Xiao Yu's face filled with concern as she glanced over at Seosu, who pretended to be fast asleep. Lin Yuan told her there was no need for her to bother so much about them, but Xiao Yu snapped back, saying his growth wasn't the only thing stunted. His mental faculty was, too, because she considered both of them her brothers. An awkward silence fell, so Xiao Yu decided to leave, asking Lin Yuan to let Seosu know she'd stopped by. As soon as she left, Lin Yuan moved back to his sleeping area, still gripping his dagger. He then heard Seosu's voice, advising him not to be so hard on Xiao Yu. Lin Yuan replied that she wasn't a decent lady, having caught her smoking grass days earlier and accused her of hanging around Seosu only because he was a successful hunter. Seosu responded, saying that nobody was perfect in this world. Everyone was simply surviving and suggested that he ease up on her. The two stepped outside, gazing up at the moon. Lin Yuan asked why Seosu was awake, having thought he was sleeping. Seosu admitted he was restless, suspecting he might have some kind of special skill, but hadn't figured it out yet. Staring at the moon, he recalled the day he discovered Lin Yuan had a unique ability. During one of their hunts, with no prey in sight, Lin Yuan had wished for a catch, and a sparrow immediately fell from the sky. However, each use of Lin Yuan's wishing skill caused him minor illnesses as a side effect. Back in the present, Lin Yuan spotted a shooting star, and Seosu quickly grabbed his hand, warning him not to make any random wish like summoning endless tacos, as who knew what might happen. The next day at the rural school, the gray-haired teacher, Jinglin, taught the class about technology from the civilized age. Seosu watched from the window as Jinglin asked the meaning of technology, but the kids, bored to death with his boomer teaching style, wished they could just die already. He ordered them to pay attention, and just as he was about explaining what technology was, while Seosu stared intently to learn like a serious student. Luckily, the recess bell rang, so Jinglin closed his book and instructed the kids to go home to eat. He glanced at the window where Seosu had stayed but didn't find him there. He found him outside, so he informed Seosu that in the future he shouldn't stay at the window. He could stand by the door, though he wasn't allowed inside. Seosu nodded gratefully, thanking him for his kindness. Later, Jinglin took a break for soup, and Seosu offered him a cigarette in gratitude. With a smile, Seosu remarked that because of his kindness, Jinglin had allowed him to listen to his lecture without tuition. Jinglin struck a match, lit the cigarette, puffed like a retired junkie, and then asked why Seosu was so interested in learning when survival was everyone's focus. Seosu replied that learning couldn't hurt, and teachers were well respected. After all, no one dared to steal from Jinglin's vegetable patch. Just then, Jinglin began to cough from the cigarette smoke entering his lungs. However, Seosu ignored the old smoker and with a serious face asked what happened to the technology humans had before the catastrophe that destroyed mankind. Jinglin, still smoking, explained that the generation was broken, and because of that everyone was concerned about survival, and he wondered why Seosu was still concerned about learning. After saying that, he answered Seosu's question about technology, saying it was now in the hands of those behind the giant wall. Angrily, Seosu looked toward the wall and asked why it couldn't be broken down to recover the technology. Jinglin explained that the wall protected them, as most beasts avoided attacking humans in groups. Seosu argued that without technology, humanity couldn't rebuild civilization. Taking a long drag of smoke, Jinglin pointed out that as long as danger lingered, people would depend on the stronghold for survival, while the elites behind the wall thrived. These elites, he added, preferred the wall up, as it gave them a sense of superiority. With that, Jinglin extinguished the cigarette, saying he didn't want to discuss it further as it was time for class. Just then, Seosu received a quest in his mind, instructing him that his thirst for knowledge wasn't a bad thing, but that he would need to share what he had learned. Minutes later, Jinglin re-entered the classroom, directing the students to settle down, while Seosu stood outside the door like a malnourished bouncer. Jinglin began the lesson on survival, advising the kids not to think danger was far away simply because their parents were around to protect them. One day he warned they needed to defend themselves. He asked what they would do if they encountered wolves in the wild, then turned to Xiaosu by the entrance to answer. Surprised by the question, Xiaosu eventually replied that finding high ground was the best option, as it offered a wide field of view and scattered scent in the wind. Jinglin nodded as though impressed, but Xiaosu grinned, giving him a thumbs up and adding that high ground was also the ideal place to be buried, leaving Jinglin in shock. An awkward silence fell across the class as the students turned to see who had spoken. Meanwhile, Xiaosu wondered why the quest in his mind hadn't been completed, since he had just shared the information he was supposed to. Jinglin cleared his throat, and Xiaosu stared at him, reiterating that whether faced with a single wolf or a whole pack, the answer was the same: find a spot to be buried. Jinglin stared in disbelief, not expecting Xiaosu to be so knowledgeable. With that, Jinglin told Xiaosu that from then on, he could sit inside the class and even teach the kids some survival skills. Xiaosu's eyes widened in surprise, and he thanked Jinglin. Just then, a system window popped up, notifying Xiaosu that he had completed the quest and earned an additional point of strength. That moment, his body transformed, his muscles bulged slightly, and he felt a surge of new power. He finally realized the palace in his mind wasn't just a fantasy. He truly had a unique skill. Since an average adult's strength was 3, and he had been at 2.5, the added point put him above average. This meant his survival chances in the wasteland had just significantly improved. Later that day after school, Xiaosu and Lin Yuan walked home. Lin Yuan was surprised that Jinglin had let Xiaosu into the class and even asked him to help teach. He wondered if the old man wanted Xiaosu as his successor, but Xiaosu cut him off, saying that the man who smoked like a chimney probably just wanted more cigarettes. Xiaosu added that he wasn't the type to be a teacher. He was more of a gangsta type of guy, and he might just pass the teaching role on to Lin Yuan. As they walked, they passed a group of mercenaries. One complained that all he wanted was a day off and hated being sent to the wilderness. Another suggested they should ask Fu Gui, the merchant from earlier, if he knew someone who could guide them. Xiaosu recognized them as mercenaries from the giant wall, who were clueless about real combat and likely walking into a suicide mission in the wild. Just then, a girl in a hoodie passed him, giving off a wild animal vibe. Lin Yuan nudged him, asking if Fu Gui might recommend Xiaosu to the mercenaries as a guide since he knew the wilderness better than anyone. Xiaosu replied that he wouldn't venture into dangerous areas and advised Lin Yuan to avoid them too. Soon after, they arrived home, and Lin Yuan asked if Xiaosu's hand had healed. Xiaosu assured him it was fine, though Lin Yuan knew he was capping, but Xiaosu promised he wouldn't take risks with his life. Just then, they heard voices outside their hut asking if Xiaosu had really survived a wolf attack. They both turned toward the door, with Xiaosu instructing Lin Yuan to stay inside and keep quiet. Xiaosu then moved towards the door, peeking outside to see who the people were. Meanwhile, just outside the hut, Fu Gui revealed to the commander that the person they were about to meet had a lot of screws loose in his head. Inside the tent, Xiaosu watched them and was infuriated by the fact that Fu Gui really did bring the mercenaries to his home like Lin Yuan had predicted. Outside the hut, Fu Gui called out to Xiaosu to come out. Lin Yuan began to panic, but Xiaosu instructed him to chill inside the hut while he headed out to answer. After that, Xiaosu swung the curtains wide open and stepped outside. In the blink of an eye, he rushed at Fu Gui like a madman, loudly congratulating him on the safe arrival of the father and child, and announcing that the baby weighed 3 kilograms. Fu Gui and the mercenaries were completely baffled. One mercenary looked at Fu Gui, demanding to know what Xiaosu was talking about. Frustrated, he yelled that Fu Gui had brought them to a lunatic as a guide. The mercenary leader grabbed Fu Gui by the collar, asking why he deceived them by bringing in a demented Krakus. Following that, the squad turned to leave while Fu Gui tried to explain, saying he hadn't realized Xiaosu's madness had leveled up. The commander then yelled that Fu Gui had until dawn to find them a suitable guide. As they walked away, the girl in the hoodie paused, glanced at Xiaosu, and then continued on her way. Xiaosu, on the other hand, watched her with curiosity. Just then, a system notification appeared, informing him that he had randomly copied one of her skills. He stared at the manuscript on the screen, which asked if he wanted to learn the skill, and stood in stunned silence. At that moment, Xiaosu's system began to upload a wealth of knowledge about firearms, surprising him since he'd never believed it possible to copy other skills. Amidst a bright light, the system notified him that he had successfully mastered advanced firearms proficiency. It also informed him that he possessed the ability to replicate other people's superpowers. Intrigued, Seosu decided to check the skill level of the hoodie-wearing girl and found out she was a perfect shot. This revelation shocked him as he wondered what a master-level sharpshooter was doing in the company of mercenaries. Just then, he felt a sharp pain at the back of his head and turned to see Liyuan tugging at his garment. Liyuan demanded to know why he was staring at the hoodie girl's kiat as she walked away. Xiao Yu suddenly appeared, asking which girl's kiat the cultured creep was supposedly staring. Seosu was taken aback, wondering where Xiao Yu had come from. She explained that she had swapped apartments with a family of 3 who had lived next door, making her their new neighbor. Hearing this, Lin Yuan quickly grabbed Seosu by the head, warning that his plot was destined for ruin since the girl was determined to clap him by any means necessary. Seosu immediately grabbed the cheeky imp, yelling that he was too young to understand anything about plot development. He then waved at Xiao Yu and pushed Lin Yuan toward the hut, telling him to stop trying to set him up with her. Just then, Lin Yuan's eyes widened in surprise as he pointed to 2 potatoes and a pill hidden under the chair. Seosu picked up the pill and realized it was an anti-inflammatory medication for his injured hand, instantly recalling that someone had secretly supplied him with pills the previous year when he was attacked by wolves. He'd been searching for the Good Samaritan ever since, suspecting it might be the same person. Lin Yuan speculated that it could be Xiao Yu, as she was the only one apart from them who knew about his injuries. Meanwhile, outside the hut, a hand holding a cigarette grabbed Xiao Yu, and a voice told her he'd been looking everywhere to give her cigarette. Xiao Yu screamed, protesting that she was no longer a bad chick. Hearing her scream, Seosu instantly seized his sword. Outside, the warthog-faced man tore at Xiao Yu's clothes, exposing part of her melons as she screamed for him to leave her alone. Without hesitation, Seosu burst from the hut at full speed, and a system notification appeared with a new quest to help her. With a menacing grin, he gripped his sword hilt and charged at the man. The scoundrel, seeing Seosu rushing toward him, was momentarily stunned but then smirked when he realized the little guy was wielding only a bone knife. He instantly unleashed his giant machete, but before he could strike, Seosu's blade clashed with his, shattering both weapons in one blow. Stunned, the worthless bum watched as the handle of his weapon slipped from his grasp. Seosu wasted no second. He seized the man's arm, summoned his strength, and delivered a powerful punch to the idiot's jaw that would make Saitama proud. He then slammed the thug's head to the ground, pinning him as the man lay dazed, baffled at how someone so young could be so strong. Turning to Xiao Yu, Seosu asked who the guy was. She explained he was a local coal miner and the leader of a gang who had stabbed someone to death the night before. Seosu glared at the man in disgust, picked up a shard of his broken blade, and moved in for a final blow. Just then, the system alerted him to a quest instructing him to spare his enemy, delivering a surprising twist. So instead, he slashed the thug's ribs, warning him that he had 3 minutes to reach the town clinic and get stitched up if he wanted a chance at survival. The dude's face bloodied, struggled to his feet, clutching his injured side as he fled, leaving a trail of blood behind. With that, the system notified Seosu that the quest was complete. However, Lin Yuan warned that it might be a mistake to let the guy go, as he could come back for revenge, but Seosu assured him that the clinic was a shitty one, that they'd never stitch him up in time. Seosu then picked up the hilt of his broken sword and told Xiao Yu to quit smoking, which she agreed to with a nod. He added with a smirk that though he was well aware of his ultimate riddance that could charm any girl, nothing could happen between them. Xiao Yu, surprised, retorted that he shouldn't flatter himself as she only saw him as a brother. Embarrassed, the laughed and then grabbed Lin Yuan by the neck, grumbling that it was Lin Yuan's talk that led him to believe the hottie had liked him. Just then, a dark aura filled the mind palace as a typewriter in the center of the palace began to clack, typing a message on a piece of paper. It read that a new side quest had been activated. Seosu retrieved the letter from the typewriter, stared at it, and read that he'd been assigned a side quest due to losing his damaged blade. The quest required him to collect 100 genuine expressions of gratitude to unlock a new weapon. This surprised Seosu, and he stood frozen for a moment, remembering that Xiao Yu had thanked him for saving her from the bum who'd attacked her. That instant, another piece of paper printed from the typewriter, notifying him he'd received +1 gratitude, leaving 99 to go. Now alert, Chiyosu immediately rushed to Lin Yuan, demanding he show gratitude by thanking him. Lin Yuan looked at him, remarking that his case behavior and ugly face was scaring the shit out of him. Chiyosu yelled at him to speak up, telling him not to be intimidated by his ugly face. Finally, Lin Yuan reluctantly thanked him for taking care of him, and the system rewarded Chiyosu with another +1 gratitude, making him grin victoriously. Chiyosu then asked Lin Yuan to keep thanking him, but after several attempts, he received no additional points. Realizing Lin Yuan's apologies weren't sincere, he urged him to add some feeling. Lin Yuan then began to cry, but after numerous attempts, both grew exhausted and drifted off to sleep. In his subconscious, Chiyosu found himself in his mind palace and noticed 2 coins on a table. He picked up one of the coins, engraved with the word love, and read a message on the back about a grateful heart. Puzzling over the coin's purpose, he noticed a large metal machine to his right. Approaching it, he inserted the coin, and a black bottle dropped out of the machine. Chiyosu picked up the bottle, realizing it was medicine. Suddenly, his head spun, and he woke up, still holding the bottle, shocking Lin Yuan, who asked if he'd started performing magic and where the bottle had come from. Chiyosu ignored him, opened the bottle's lid, and wondered what the medicine treated. Taking some of the black content in the bottle on his finger, he applied it to the wound on his hand, gritting his teeth as he worried he'd been reckless as it might be poison. But his eyes widened when he noticed his wound no longer hurt, bringing a smile to his face. The following morning, Chiyosu arrived at school with Lin Yuan and met Jinglin. Jinglin mentioned it was his first day as his substitute teacher and asked if he prepared his lecture, to which Chiyosu casually replied asking him not to worry. Stepping in front of the class, Chiyosu knew this was the perfect chance to gather gratitude points. His eyes sparkled as he thought of a level 500 IQ idea. He told the kids that teachers went through a lot. While students sat, teachers had to stand all day, and for that, they should show gratitude. He ordered the class to stand and say thank you, which they did, but no gratitude points appeared, and Chiyosu knew none of the little were sincere. Accepting his fate, he proceeded with the day's lesson. A few hours later, Chiyosu continued his lecture on basic wilderness survival skills, which left the kids yawning with boredom. One student gritted his teeth, irritated at how the teacher was talking on and on like a drunken parrot. Finally, another student raised his hand as if he had an important question. When called on, he told Chiyosu it was getting late and they needed to go home. Chiyosu stared in disbelief before dismissing the class. In the blink of an eye, the kids bolted from the classroom, thanking him for his efforts. At that moment, in his subconscious, the coins on the table began to levitate, and Chiyosu realized, with a wide smile, that hard work truly paid off. This time, the kids were genuinely grateful. That evening, as Chiyosu and Lin Yuan walked home from school, Lin Yuan asked Chiyosu to stop teaching so late. Chiyosu replied, saying he had devoted his life to education, meaning he'd have to teach a little longer than a typical teacher. Hearing this, Lin Yuan clenched his teeth in frustration, accusing him of destroying the minds of the future leaders. Chiyosu teasingly grabbed his head as usual, but Lin Yuan quickly pointed at a group of mercenaries ahead of them. The commander of the mercenaries grinned with satisfaction, having just been introduced to his new guide, an older man named Liu. At the same time, Fugui approached the boys, calling Chiyosu an ungrateful bastard for rejecting the wonderful job of a guide that he'd originally offered him. Chiyosu looked at him with indifference, calmly replying that the job was far from wonderful. Fugui countered, explaining that there were both poor and rich in the stronghold, and only a select few were allowed to come and go freely. Chiyosu muttered under his breath about how the stronghold wasn't just keeping people from entering but also trapping those inside from leaving. Fugui snapped him back to reality, pointing out that the mercenaries could take whoever they wanted as a guide into the stronghold, a wonderful opportunity Chiyosu wouldn't want to miss. Lin Yuan chimed in, advising Chiyosu not to pass up the chance and to convince the mercenaries to choose him instead of old Liu. But Chiyosu silenced him, telling him to stop spouting nonsense and to hurry along. After a bit of walking, Lin Yuan spotted Xiao Yu standing nearby, attempting to sell her valuable earrings to a man. Chiyosu approached her and handed her money, calling it payment for the medicine she'd secretly given him. Though reluctant to accept it, Chiyosu reassured her, saying he'd intended to buy medicine with the money anyway, but wouldn't be needing it now. With a hand on his chest, he promised that as long as he had food to eat, she'd never go hungry, a pledge that made Xiao Yu blush. At that moment, they noticed a woman kneeling on the ground, begging for her husband's life. A man in a white lab coat stood in front of her, and the wounded man was lying beside her. The doctor coldly informed her that without money, she'd never be attended to. Chiosu, Lin Yuan, and Xiao Yu watched as the woman pleaded for help, only to be ignored by the doctor, who shut the door in her face. Chiosu felt a surge of anger and told Lin Yuan to remember everything he'd just seen, as that was the harsh reality they lived in. Just then, the acid rain started to drizzle, so they hurried home. On getting home, Chiosu commented that becoming a doctor seemed like the fastest way to earn gratitude, and Lin Yuan agreed but pointed out it was a shame Chiosu lacked any medical skills. Instantly, Chiosu's 2 brain cells finally clicked. Though he didn't have medical skills, he could still learn them, earn money, and gain gratitude all at once. The next morning, Chiosu sat on the ground outside the doctor's shop, waiting with his giant frying pan. He waited until 2 p.m., when the useless doctor finally woke up, and as he stretched, he opened the store door. The doctor nearly gave up the ghost at the sight of Chiosu sitting there. Regaining his composure, he told Chiosu that without enough money, he wouldn't get attended to. Suddenly, Chiosu's system displayed a prompt asking if he wanted to randomly copy a target skill. Without hesitation, Chiosu grabbed the prompt, and the system asked if he wanted to copy the target's deception skill. Disgusted, Chiosu dropped the paper, which disintegrated, and realized that instead of medical skills, the system had offered him deception skills. Seething with anger, Chiosu stared at the doctor, realizing the man was nothing more than a fraud. Not missing a beat, he hurled his frying pan, hitting the doctor square on the head while shouting that the man had been scamming people and profiting through lies. The deceitful doctor crumpled to the ground, whimpering, while Chiosu slung his frying pan over his shoulder and walked away, wondering how he could become a real doctor without medical knowledge. He glanced at his healing wound and remembered the large machine that dispensed the black medicine bottle. Inspired, he had a flash of genius. He'd specialize in treating knife wounds. Soon after, Chiosu arrived home and was surprised to see Xiao Yu in the hut, taking care of things like a waifu. As he stepped inside, Lin Yuan walked past him with a bowl of porridge that Xiao Yu had prepared, so he quickly grabbed Lin Yuan by the neck, asking if he'd thanked Xiao Yu properly. Lin Yuan, bowing his head, thanked Xiao Yu, calling her a wife material. After that, Xiao Yu served Chiosu his porridge, and the 3 enjoyed their meal together. While they ate, Chiosu complimented Xiao Yu on her sewing skills, saying he'd love for her to join him in his clinic business for treating knife wounds. Later that night, lying on his raft bed, Chiosu entered his subconscious palace to check on his progress. He opened the palace doors and found 3 gratitude coins on the table. Smiling, he remembered that 1 gratitude coin could be exchanged for a bottle of black medicine, which could heal 3 people on average. The more people he healed, the more gratitude he'd gain, bringing him closer to unlocking his new weapon. The next morning, Chiosu went out to the fields and began digging in the ground with a dagger. As he did this, a shaved-headed man watched him closely, curious about his activity. The man asked Chiosu what he was doing with the weeds, but Chiosu ignored him and continued picking herbs. Chiosu knew it was important for people to see him gathering herbs to make them believe he was indeed becoming a healer. After a while, Chiosu finally responded, telling the man that he was gathering herbs, not weeds, and that the herbs could be boiled to help heal wounds, just like his own. Hearing this, the man was stunned, wondering when Chiosu had become a healer. Word quickly spread throughout town that Chiosu was now a healer, and soon a crowd gathered outside his tent to see for themselves. Chiosu laughed as he saw the townsfolk gossiping among themselves, but when no one stepped forward to get treated, he grew frustrated and decided to go outside to encourage them, pointing to one man and asking him to be his first patient. The man, sweating nervously, walked over to Chiosu, who grabbed his shoulder and instructed him to ask what he was doing. The guy, still confused, replied that only a madman would know what Chiosu was up to. Chiosu smiled and explained that he was making a healing ointment to reduce inflammation and pain. He then told the crowd that although he had hidden his herb-making skills for a long time, he was ready to share them with the world. However, the townsfolk found it hard to believe that the town's resident madman was suddenly a healer and started to leave. Not wanting to lose their interest, Chiosu noticed a small knife cut on the arm of the man beside him. He quickly grabbed the man's arm, announcing he had the perfect medicine to heal it. The man resisted, but Chiosu pinned him down and forcibly applied the black medicine to his wound for the sake of publicity, ignoring the man's screams for help. After that, he let the man go, entered back to the hut to find Lin Yuan sitting, who teased him, saying he never thought he'd see the day Chiosu healed someone for free. Chiyosu shot him a glare and explained that some sacrifices were necessary to achieve his greater goals. The following day, Chiyosu stepped outside and found Fugi waiting for him. He told Fuga that he hadn't caught any sparrows to sell, but Fuga laughed, asking if he'd healed Ironhead's injury the day before. Fugu then asked Chiyosu to hand over any leftover medicine so he could sell it on his behalf, but Chiyosu declined. Persistently, Fugu then offered to buy the medicine directly, pointing out that Chiyosu's wound was healed and that he wouldn't need it anymore. Fugu added that Ironhead had accidentally ingested the medicine, turning him into Clap Master 3000, keeping his wife up all night with some intense workout session. Curious, Fugu asked where Chiyosu had found such a remarkable medicine. Chiyosu cryptically replied that it was a gift from his ancestors. After much negotiation, Chiyosu finally agreed to sell the medicine to Fugu for $600. Fugu happily handed him the money, thanking him profusely. Chiyosu then received a system notification, rewarding him with +1 gratitude while Fugu walked away, grinning like a kid with a candy bar. Soon afterwards, Fugu presented the black medicine to a man in a black suit. In the following weeks, Chiyosu officially launched his wound healing business, proudly setting up a banner in front of his house and standing back with his hands on his hips, admiring his work. Just then, he noticed 3 wounded losers limping past his shop on their way to the town clinic. His eyes sparkled with excitement at the sight of potential customers, and his mind system prompted him with a side mission to treat these 3. Wasting no time, he rushed over, seized them, and dragged them back to his shop like. One of the men, with the face of Chucky, screamed, asking what the hell was wrong with him. Chiyosu turned and told him the clinic doctor was a fraud, and he was actually saving their worthless lives. Right then, Xiaoyu opened the curtain, so Chiyosu asked her to tend to the injured men. Seeing them sprawled out on the floor badly wounded, Xiaoyu wondered if the men had been involved in a fight with Thanos. In pain, one of the guys explained that a boiler had exploded at the factory, taking several lives, and they were lucky to have survived. A bit later, they managed to get the men inside and Chiyosu instructed Xiaoyu to disinfect a needle for stitching them up. She agreed, heated the needle over a flame, and began stitching one man's leg. As soon as the hot needle touched his skin, the dude screamed like he was undergoing castration, cursing Xiaoyu for not waiting until it had cooled before using it on his delicate skin. Chiyosu quickly apologized on her behalf, explaining it was her first day on the job. After that, Chiyosu brought out the black medicine, smiling slyly as he informed them he'd be charging $600 each for the treatment. Grabbing one man by the collar, he remarked that $600 was nothing since he earned $2,000 a month at the factory. Chiyosu then started applying the black medicine to the stitched wounds, but one of the men, unable to endure the treatment, sprang up and bolted out the door. The second man tried to follow, but Chiyosu grabbed his shoulder, stopping him. Chiyosu then dashed after the escapee, while Xiaoyu, smiling innocently, assured the last man he'd be next in line. After several minutes of running, the man grew exhausted and stopped to catch his breath, only to feel Chiyosu's firm grip on his shoulder. Turning, he found Chiyosu looming over him with a look of deep dissatisfaction. Chiyosu dragged him back to the shop on his shoulder, and his wound was eventually tended to. Hours later, the men lay bandaged up on beds, finally feeling some relief. The system then notified Chiyosu that he'd been awarded a strength and agility point, and he received a new side mission to treat 10 more patients. Later that night, word spread through town that a wolf pack had invaded. Alarmed, Chiyosu and his team took note, while Linyuan anxiously asked if the wolves would come near their neighborhood. Chiyosu reassured him that the wolves would likely head toward the factory, drawn by the scent of blood from the boiler explosion. With a determined look, he added that the wolves wouldn't dare come near their settlement, because they were close to the stronghold. Just then, they heard a voice outside ordering everyone to gather, as an enemy was approaching. Chiyosu quickly extinguished the candle and peeked out the window. Linyuan noticed Chiyosu's concerned expression and asked what was on his mind. Chiyosu admitted he was worried, wondering if the stronghold might someday collapse. Xiaoyu overheard and asked if that was really possible. Chiyosu simply replied that nothing lasts forever. At that moment, the giant gate of the stronghold swung open, and armed mercenaries poured out to defend the town against the wolves. Watching the soldiers, Chiyosu recognized the guns they wielded and knew how to operate them, thanks to a skill mastery scroll he had acquired earlier. He then told Linyuan to stay at Xiaoyu's place for the night, promising to return soon. As he headed out, Linyuan called after him, asking where he was going. In another scene, the scam of a doctor was squatting with his pants down, relieving himself when he noticed Seosu sprinting at an incredible speed. Curious, he leaned forward to get a better look, and once he confirmed it was Seosu, he wondered where he could be rushing off to at that time of night. Meanwhile, Seosu raced toward the burning factory, suspecting that even the armed factory managers had likely been overrun by wolves. As he approached the entrance, the sight of the blood-red sky looming over the factory made him break out in a cold sweat. Inside, the mercenaries faced a pack of SSS-rank ferocious wolves. They aimed their guns at the wolves, and just then a man with suit ordered them to hurry up and fire the wolves immediately. The soldiers complied, but their gunfire only enraged the wolves further. In a furious frenzy, the wolves lunged at the soldiers, devouring them like sushi, spewing blood everywhere. Amidst the chaos, Seosu managed to find a hidden entryway into the factory. He turned a corner only to see corpses strewn across the ground. The state of the bodies confirmed to him that the wolves had made quick work of them with lethal bites. Determined to reach the main factory area, which was several floors up, Seosu braced himself and climbed the building like an Assassin's Creed wannabe. Using stair railings for support, he skillfully scaled up to the midway point. With a deep breath, he covered his face with his hoodie, gripped his weapon, and executed a flawless Batman entrance through a window into the main factory. Inside, more bodies lay in a pattern, suggesting they had been heading for the emergency shelter. Following the trail, Seosu found a massive metal door with 3 red lights above it, confirming it was the shelter. He approached and, realizing it was locked, knocked instinctively like a fool before quickly realizing how foolish that was. With that, he pressed a large red button on the wall, and that instant he noticed the iron door opening from inside and rolled in swiftly. Inside, he was met by a middle-aged man who looked stunned to see Seosu, mistaking him for a soldier sent to help. Realization dawned on the man's face, and he aimed his gun at Seosu, recognizing him as an intruder. Seosu recognized the man as Dongyang, the factory manager. That moment, Dongyang pressed the red button, shutting the door behind them, and aimed his gun with a steady hand. Seosu, holding his blade, smirked and asked Dongyang why he was alone in the shelter. When Dongyang didn't answer, Seosu's anger flared as he guessed that Dongyang had locked himself inside, abandoning everyone else outside to die. Dongyang sneered, calling Seosu a miserable wretch and ordering him to carry him back to town if he valued his life. Seosu gritted his teeth and demanded to know why he should spare the man who had sacrificed his own colleagues to save himself. Dongyang, still pointing the pistol, smirked and threatened to end Seosu's life before resuming his wait for the army. Seosu, unfazed, calmly pointed out that the gun's safety was still on. As Dongyang glanced at the gun, Seosu seized the moment, slashing Dongyang's hand and snatching the weapon. He followed up with a fierce, Tekken-style elbow to Dongyang's gut, sending him crashing into the wall before piercing his stomach with the blade. Dongyang gasped, blood trickling from his mouth, and begged for his life, promising to give Seosu all his money. Seosu asked for the stash's location, pretending to consider the offer. However, Dongyang's real plan was to buy time until reinforcements arrived, but Seosu saw through his ruse. With a final thrust, Seosu drove the blade deeper into Dongyang's gut, silencing him as he collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Searching his pockets, Seosu found 2 extra magazines and left with the pistol before the army arrived. Shortly after, Seosu arrived home, drained from the night's events. Lin Yuan, noticing him, immediately asked if he was hurt, but Seosu assured him he wasn't, and then inquired if the private army had returned. Lin Yuan nodded, explaining that some soldiers had come back with the injured while still inspecting Seosu to make sure he was truly unscathed. Seosu was taken aback, surprised that firearms had been enough to scare off the wolves. At that moment, 2 trucks rolled out from the stronghold, stopping in the center of town. Soldiers who had emerged from inside the truck ordered the townspeople to come out. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd until the commander, visibly irritated, announced that anyone who could identify the person who left town that night would be handsomely rewarded. Just then, Seosu and Lin Yuan stepped outside their tent to see what the commotion was about. A chill ran down Seosu's spine as he speculated why the soldiers were there. He thought about how he had disguised Dongyang's stab wounds as wolf-inflicted, but he quickly suspected they might be searching for the missing pistol. That moment, the soldiers began frisking the townsfolk, but suddenly, a voice broke through the tension, claiming to know who had left town that night. The quack doctor pointed dramatically at Seosu, announcing that he was the one causing Xiaosu's eyes to widen in disbelief. Without delay, the commander ordered the soldiers to search all of Xiaosu's belongings. Seeing this, Fu Gui rushed over, shouting for them to stop, declaring that Xiaosu was under the protection of Luo, the boss of the stronghold. The commander, puzzled, asked what Fu Gui meant, and Fu Gui told him to ask Luo himself if he needed confirmation. The commander's eyes flickered with recognition at Luo's name, but he barked that even with Luo's protection, he wouldn't let the issue slide. After saying that, he commanded the search to continue. The soldiers searched Xiaosu, but came up empty-handed. So they moved toward his tent, but Lin Yuan stood at the entrance, blade in hand, ready to defend it. Xiaosu shouted for Lin Yuan to step aside, and with reluctance, Lin Yuan obeyed, grinding his teeth in frustration. Seeing this, the scanned doctor smiled smugly, relishing the scene. The soldiers searched around the tent, and then began tearing through the small, shabby space. Lin Yuan could only pray anxiously that nothing incriminating would be found. As a soldier was about to check beneath the frying pan, the commander stormed into the tent and demanded an update. The soldier reported that they had found nothing, explaining that the place was so sparse that any hidden pistol would have been discovered by now. Satisfied, the commander ordered them to pull back, and they left. Little did they know, the pistol was stashed right under the frying pan. After the ordeal, Lin Yuan sighed in relief, thankful that nothing had been found, while Xiaosu shot a deadly glare at the smug quack doctor. Following that, Xiaosu then turned to thank Fu Gui for intervening. Fu Gui grinned and said that without boss Luo's influence, he wouldn't have been able to step in. When Xiaosu asked who Luo was, Fu Gui explained that Luo was the King Consortium's representative at the stronghold and had developed a fondness for Xiaosu's black medicine. Fu Gui added that Luo promised Xiaosu's safety outside the stronghold if he delivered a fixed amount of the black medicine each month. With a serious expression, Xiaosu instructed Fu Gui to ask Luo to let them inside the stronghold. Fu Gui shook his head, saying they were unclean and wouldn't be allowed inside. But Xiaosu had his suspicions. He knew Luo needed him outside to continue producing the black medicine. Suddenly, Lin Yuan swayed and grabbed Xiaosu's clothes to steady himself. Before Xiaosu could react, Lin Yuan collapsed to the ground. Soon after, Lin Yuan was laid on the thatched bed with Xiao Yu and Xiaosu tending to him. Xiaosu's concern deepened as he realized Lin Yuan had taken the brunt of a wish made on his behalf, suffering the backlash. Just then, Lin Yuan slowly regained consciousness, panicking that he might die. However, Xiao Yu gently wrung out a cloth soaked in cool water and placed it on his forehead to reduce his fever. Seeing this, Lin Yuan thanked Xiao Yu for her care, admitting his regret for treating her poorly in the past. Xiao Yu simply smiled and told him not to apologize, teasing that he was just acting like a typical foolish Gen Z, watching how attentively Xiao Yu cared for his brother. Xiaosu silently vowed to give her all the comfort he could. The next morning, Xiaosu stepped out of the tent and was startled when someone called his name. Fu Gui approached, congratulating him on becoming the town's only doctor, since the fraudulent doctor had fled in fear. He added that the stronghold administrators had gifted Xiaosu the brick house that belonged to Dr. Swindler and said he could move in immediately. Fu Gui then handed Xiaosu a gift box, telling him it contained a supplement. Opening the box, Xiaosu found a bird's nest and recalled Qinglin, once telling him it was made from swallow saliva. However, he accepted it with a mix of curiosity. Switching to business, Fu Gui told Xiaosu he needed another supply of the black medicine. Xiaosu, taken aback, calmly told him he just bought one recently and assumed the old man must be the chief clap officer to need one again so soon. Embarrassed, Fu Gui covered his sausage region, explaining that the medicine wasn't for him, but for the people in the stronghold. Xiaosu then agreed to sell the black medicine for $1,200, which Fu Gui quickly paid. The system then notified Xiaosu that he had received a gratitude point, making him question just how sincere Fu Gui's thanks usually were. Before leaving, Fu Gui reminded Xiaosu to move into the brick house before someone else claimed it. That afternoon, Xiaosu, Lin Yuan, and Xiao Yu arrived at their new brick house. As they stepped inside, the system asked if Xiaosu would like to resume his unfinished mission of healing 10 patients. With determination, Xiaosu told the system to continue. Just then, a man entered the clinic with his pregnant wife. Xiaosu welcomed them warmly and asked if they were injured. The man explained that his wife, who was 4 months pregnant, was experiencing severe stomach pain. Xiaosu chuckled lightly and asked what she was expecting, but then froze when he realized he wasn't experienced in obstetrics. He admitted honestly that he wasn't trained in childbirth and suggested they see Jinglin, who had the knowledge to help. The man appreciated Seosu's honesty, noting that the previous doctor would have scammed them into buying useless medicines. The couple bowed gratefully, and the system informed Seosu that he had earned more gratitude points. With a renewed sense of purpose, Seosu stepped back into the clinic, resolving to treat only what he was capable of and to be honest about his limitations. Over the following weeks, Seosu diligently treated patients, bringing his mission count to 9 out of 10. After stitching up another patient, he bowed graciously, thanking them and hoping for their return. His gratitude points surged, and he finally completed the mission, earning 1 strength point. His next challenge, however, was to heal 20 patients. Curious about his progress, Seosu checked his current stats and entered the shadowy palace within his mind, discovering he had accumulated 5.5 strength points and 4.1 agility points. Later that day, an ugly weirdo entered the clinic, insisting his problem be kept secret. Seosu, raising an eyebrow, asked if it was a rod issue, but the man, now sweating, nervously denied it and told him to stop speaking nonsense. Locking the door, the man prepared to demonstrate his ailment while Seosu watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The man took a deep breath, inhaling a large volume of air, and released it in Seosu's direction. To Seosu's shock, the exhaled air condensed into a glowing transparent sphere that burst with a dazzling mystical energy. The blast sent Seosu staggering backwards and launched Lin Yuan clear across the room. As the energy dissipated, Seosu stared at the man, stunned, telling him he was not sick, but had a supernatural ability. Elated, the man grinned and asked if this meant he could join the Avengers. Seosu nodded with a smirk, and the man bowed deeply in gratitude. Just then, the system promptly awarded Seosu an additional gratitude point. That night, as Seosu lay in bed, he mulled over the encounter with the strange patient and wondered if the town was undergoing some kind of transformation. The wasteland felt more perilous than ever, and Seosu realized he had also developed the Mind Palace ability. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside the clinic. 3 masked burglars, looking like low-budget mafias, had scaled the fence and landed in the clinic's yard. As they landed, they were met by a towering shadow. Seosu, with glowing red eyes that cut through the dark, sent shivers down their spines. Wasting no time, Seosu lunged at one of them, delivering a swift kick straight to his groin and sending the thief crumpling to the ground in agony, clutching himself. The downed man barked at his comrades to attack. The remaining 2 advanced with their fists raised, but Seosu stood unmoved. Under the silver light of the moon, he dispatched them effortlessly, leaving them groveling and begging for mercy. Seosu demanded to know who sent them, his voice low and threatening. Before they could answer, a loud banging at the clinic door interrupted the scene. Soldiers from the stronghold called out, demanding Seosu open up immediately. Seosu's mind raced if it were late-night patients in need of urgent care knocking his door. Seosu then opened the door to find the army commander standing there, who had announced that they were there to conduct a search of the house. The commander instructed the soldiers to proceed, and they moved inside, only to discover the 3 soldiers they had secretly sent now tied up. Staring at Seosu in disbelief at his ability to subdue them, the commander was met with Seosu's indifferent glance as he turned his head away. The commander then introduced himself as Wang Kongyang. Seosu responded with a slight smile, speculating whether Kongyang was related to Dongyang, the factory manager he had murdered. After a thorough search of the house, the soldiers came up empty-handed regarding any firearms. Kongyang assured Seosu that he wouldn't rest until the thief responsible for the missing pistol was apprehended. As he was leaving, Kongyang remarked that Seosu would have thrived if he had been born within the stronghold, and invited him to join his unit, implying it would be a better use of his skills than remaining outside. With the army's departure, Seosu felt relieved that he had hidden the guns in the mountains during his herb-gathering trip a few days prior, saving himself from being caught unprepared. The next morning, voices outside woke Seosu, announcing the return of the scouting band. He and Lin Yuan stepped outside to witness the soldiers' return from the mountains. The townspeople were taken aback by the soldiers' disheveled and defeated appearance, guessing that they had not even reached the foot of the mountains and had perhaps only faced the wolves along the road. However, Seosu suspected the soldiers encountered something far more menacing than the wolf pack that had appeared shortly after their departure. His eyes caught sight of the hooded girl, who, despite everything, still looked snatched. He reasoned she must be the strongest among them to have survived unscathed. The soldiers, accompanied by a white-haired girl, approached Fu Gai, and angrily accused him of giving them an incompetent old fool as a guide who misled them with poor directions. Stunned, Fugui asked where the guide was now, to which the white-haired girl responded that his body had been found near the river, savaged by a fierce river beast. Fugui mentioned he had previously suggested Xiaosu as the best guide, but now Xiaosu was committed to working with Boss Luo. The mention of Luo's name startled the girl, and she departed with the soldiers back to the stronghold. Fugui shot a glance at Xiaosu before running up to him, demanding he thanked him for driving the soldiers away, and stated he had only recommended him as a guide with good intentions. Xiaosu retorted that if Fugui wanted to guide the soldiers, all he needed was a hand-drawn map of the route, so he could get into the stronghold himself. Fugui admitted he couldn't leave his son behind, to which Xiaosu replied that he had Lin Yuan and Xiao Yu, he wouldn't abandon either. Their argument escalated into loud bickering, with Lin Yuan stuck in the middle, confused about their heated exchange. Their squabble was interrupted when they suddenly noticed two masked soldiers escorting the man with the unusual salva-based powers away. Xiaosu watched the scene unfold, his mind racing with the possibility that the stronghold had finally discovered the man's mysterious abilities. The townspeople were outraged that the soldiers were taking one of their own, but the soldiers threatened them with their guns. Fugui joined in, shouting that even though the guy had the ugliest face ever, he shouldn't be arrested for that. One of the soldiers quickly showed Fugui that his pistol wasn't a toy but the real deal. Scared, Fugui backed off, while Xiaosu continued to wonder why the soldiers were arresting the man named Bao Zhen, suspecting it might be due to his supernatural abilities. As the soldier left with Bao Zhen, Fugui told Xiaosu that Bao Zhen was doomed, and Xiaosu asked why he thought so. Fugui explained that the night before, Bao Zhen had shown off his supernatural powers to his friends, who then snitched to the stronghold. The stronghold had been on the lookout for anyone with supernatural abilities who could pose a threat. He added that the stronghold had established a mental hospital where they locked up people with powers to study them. Fugui then warned Xiaosu that if he or his brother ever discovered they had any supernatural abilities, they should keep it a secret from everyone. In another part of town, Bao Zhen's parents attacked the traitors who had ratted him out. Bao Zhen's father, covered in blood and wielding an axe, furiously declared that snitches get stitches, but at that moment, one of the traitors stabbed him in the back. Despite the wound, Bao Zhen's father managed to strike down his attacker before both collapsed to the ground. Bao Zhen's mother watched in shock, clutching her husband and, overcome with grief, took her own life by stabbing herself in the neck. The entire town, including Xiaosu and Fugui, witnessed this brutal scene. Xiaosu was furious, thinking that the world had become really twisted as no one cared about anyone anymore. Later that day, Xiaosu met up with Jinglin at school. Still shaken by what he had witnessed, Xiaosu told Jinglin he wanted to teach the students how to fight. Jinglin responded, reminding him that for years he'd been teaching the students to face the natural world, not to view their own kind as enemies. Shortly afterwards, as Xiaosu walked to class, he noticed a group of students harassing Lin Yuan. Watching from a distance, he guessed they'd somehow discovered Lin Yuan's supernatural powers. Meanwhile, a girl, uglier than Dracula, warned Lin Yuan to tell his brother, the teacher, to stop dragging out the lesson like he was Steve Jobs. Lin Yuan, furious, shot back that she should be grateful his brother was teaching them life-saving skills. After the argument, a chubby boy stared at Lin Yuan, who then asked why he was looking at him like he'd just seen a falling star. The kid, wide-eyed, said he'd had a nightmare that his father would bring home a terrible stepmother. Lin Yuan reassured him, saying dreams often mean the opposite. Maybe his father would bring him a stepfather instead. Insert meme. What do you mean by that? In class, Xiaosu demonstrated that the neck was the most vulnerable part of the body. If struck, an opponent would lose their ability to fight instantly. With that, class was dismissed, and the students rushed out, happy that the useless teacher hadn't dragged out the lecture as usual. Left in the empty classroom, Xiaosu reflected on how ungrateful the students seemed, never appreciating the value of what he was teaching them. Just then, Fugui came in, urging him to pack his things immediately. Boss Lu had finally agreed for Xiaosu to guide the army to the mountains, leaving Xiaosu in utter shock. Fugui rushed into the classroom, urging Xiaosu to quickly prepare to leave since the band would be arriving soon. Meanwhile, Xiaosu wondered what could have made Boss Lu change his mind so suddenly, or if Lu had been planning the mountain expedition all along. Regardless, he had no choice but to go along with it to avoid trouble with the stronghold. With that, he took off to meet Jinglin. He updated Jinglin on the recent development and how he felt he had no choice, especially after what had happened to Bao Zhen. Jinglin assured him that while he was away, Lin Yuan and Xiao Yu could stay at the school for safety. With that, Xiaosu bowed his head, thanked Jinglin, and then headed out. A few minutes later, he arrived home and told Lin Yuan and Xiao Yu that he'd be leaving for the mountain. Although Lin Yuan begged him not to go, Xiaosu handed Xiao Yu some cash to keep and instructed him to buy cigarettes for Jinglin as payment for letting them stay at the school. He knew Xiao Yu could easily take off with the money, since out here in this wasteland, trust was a luxury, even with family. But Xiao Yu smiled and assured him she'd keep the money safe, so he needn't worry. Just then, a knock sounded on the door, and the mind system activated, giving Xiaosu a new mission: decline the offer to join the journey to the mountain. Surprised, Xiaosu wondered if the journey was dangerous enough for the system to urge him to refuse. He opened the door to find a blue-haired girl, the commander, and another man waiting outside. The white-haired girl informed him it was time to leave, but Xiaosu began muttering gibberish, pretending to be mad. However, Commander Kan Yang told him to cut the act, pointing out that they'd met before, and he knew Xiaosu's mind was sound. Realizing his plan to fake insanity wouldn't work with Kan Yang there, Xiaosu firmly declined to go with them. Instantly, the system popped up, notifying him that he had completed the mission and earned a reward, a basic skill duplication that could learn others' abilities. Kan Yang yelled at him, demanding to know where he got the nerve to refuse, but before he could finish, Xiaosu pushed him aside, announcing that he'd changed his mind and would go after all. However, he set a condition: his account would need to be credited with $30,000. The blue-haired girl initially refused, but after Xiaosu listed over 100 alternative options, she agreed to pay the $30,000. With that settled, Xiaosu added another condition: Kan Yang, with his awful attitude, couldn't come along. Kan Yang protested, but Xiaosu stood his ground, knowing Kan Yang might be a problem since he was still hunting for Dong Yang's murderer. The blue-haired girl exchanged a glance with the hooded girl, who nodded, and she informed Kan Yang he would have to sit this mission out, leaving him stunned. Xiaosu then asked their names, which they reluctantly shared. The long-faced soldier in the back was Junjing. The low-budget Nas was Dong Hang. The blue-haired girl was Xinyu. The black-haired lieutenant was Tianshu. And lastly, the hooded girl was Xiao Jin. With introductions complete, they set off for the mountains while Xiaosu waved goodbye to his potential hot wife and his pencil-sized brother. Seeing Xiaosu leave, Lin Yuan cried, but Xiao Yu comforted him, saying Xiaosu would return safely soon. As they drove deeper into the mountains, Xiaosu noticed patches of concrete on the road, remembering how Jinglin had told him that the roads were once paved with concrete before the disaster that destroyed the world. Gazing into the forest, he saw the plants thriving, a hopeful sign that families might soon have enough to eat. Just then, his stomach growled, and he wondered why the soldiers hadn't provided food. The glutton eyes lit up when he spotted packs of crackers and bottles of water. Later that night, the trucks pulled up to a clearing near the mountains and came to a stop. A soldier announced loudly that they'd be setting up camp here for a rest and ordered another soldier to distribute food and water. The soldier went to the back of the truck to get the supplies, but what he found nearly fried his senses. Xiaosu had already devoured several packs of crackers, and the soldiers shouted at him, asking if his stomach was a bottomless pit. Xiaosu shrugged, telling them it was no big deal, but they continued to scold him, calling him a pig for eating 5 packs of crackers. They quickly dragged him down from the truck to stop him from finishing all the food. The frustrated soldier reported to Xinyu, suggesting they get a new guide since this one was a literal pig. Xinyu responded that Fugai had assured them Xiaosu was the only one who could lead them to the mountains, but once they were back at the stronghold, they could deal with him however they liked. With that settled, the soldiers set up tents, gossiping among themselves about Xiaosu, mocking him as a guide who didn't even know how to pitch a tent and predicting he wouldn't last, just like their last guide, who had died in this exact spot. Hearing this, Xiaosu muttered that they were overreacting. He'd only eaten a few crackers. Hearing this, a Hulk-sized soldier approached him, warning him with a stern look to remember he was still just a refugee and not to try to hit a stone with an egg. Xiaosu replied, telling him that when an egg strikes a stone, it's the mother hen's heart that breaks, leaving the big guy speechless. Soon after, a soldier announced that they'd found footprints nearby, leading into the dense forest. As the soldiers examined them, Xiaosu wondered what kind of creature had left such tracks. He pushed past the soldiers to get a closer look, spotting food scraps left behind from their last trip here. He told the soldiers to step aside, explaining that the footprints might belong to a bear, likely drawn in by the leftover food. One of the soldiers scoffed, asking who made Seosu, a Nat Geo wild expert, to declare it was a bear. Ignoring the remark, Seosu began walking into the forest, telling the soldiers that if they wouldn't let him eat crackers, he'd go hunt his own food. A soldier yelled at him, warning that their last guide had died in this very spot, so he better not throw his life away at his useless life and waste their time. Seosu dismissed his warning as nothing more than a toddler's babbling and charged into the forest anyway, saying he'd take the chance to investigate how the last guide had died. Inside the forest, Seosu remembered that, according to Xinyu, the previous guide had died near the river, so he headed in that direction. Needing to be cautious, he picked up a stick from the ground and sharpened it with his blade, crafting a makeshift spear. Now better armed, he continued toward the river, aware that large animals tended to gather around water sources. Following the bear's tracks, he eventually reached the riverbank. He didn't see anything unusual about the river and joked to himself that the old guide was probably taken out by a fish, considering most freshwater fish were carnivorous, a fact most people didn't know. Spotting a termite nest nearby, he decided it was time for some fishing. He approached the nest, scattered it with his blade, scooped up a large piece of the nest, and pulled out the termite queen with his bare hands. Planning to use both the queen and the nest as bait, he tossed them into the river and readied his spear. As the termite queen and nest sank into the water, Seosu watched in anticipation. A moment later, a carnivorous fish surfaced to devour the termite queen, and Seosu swiftly plunged his spear into its gut. He pulled the fish out with the rope attached to his spear, then ran back to camp with it, knowing the scent of blood would attract all sorts of wild animals. Back at camp, the soldiers caught the delicious smell of roasted fish. One of them turned, irritated, seeing Seosu roasting a fish while they were left with dry biscuits. The soldiers started gossiping about him, but Seosu just kept roasting his fish, ignoring them. Suddenly, the system activated, assigning him a quest to share with others. Frustrated, Seosu got up and brought his roasted fish over to the soldiers, who assumed he was offering to share. But he walked back almost immediately, telling them he just wanted to show off how big the fish was. Right then, the system notified him that he'd completed the quest and earned 1 point in dexterity, while the soldiers looked furious. Turning to the soldiers, Seosu informed them that if they wanted a piece of his fish, they'd need to trade it for 3 bottles of water. They reluctantly agreed and then fought over the fish like starving animals. Enjoying a rare moment of peace while roasting his own portion, Chiojin sat down beside him, pointed her gun at him, and demanded a share of his fish. Startled, Seosu stammered that she could have just 2 bites. Just then, Xinyu approached, offering him a bite of her chocolate in exchange for a taste of his fish, which Seosu quickly accepted. He took the chocolate bar and downed it in 1 bite, then asked for his second bite. Meanwhile, Seojin sprinkled salt on her piece of fish as Seosu admired her pretty face, until she devoured the fish like a deranged animal, leaving him stunned and making him realize there was definitely more to a girl than just a pretty face. The next morning, Seosu woke up and couldn't find the remaining scraps of his fish. Assuming mutated ants had likely carried it off, he headed over to join the soldiers and found them preparing to move out. A soldier spotted him and ordered Seosu to walk alongside the lead vehicle to guide them toward the mountain. Seosu advised the soldier to steer clear of the river as much as possible, but the soldier dismissed his warning, saying there was nothing to worry about since only fish lived in the river. Soon after, they set off and stopped again to set up camp. Lying on the ground, Seosu glanced over at the commanding lieutenant, who was snoozing like a sloth in the tent, while another soldier was yawning wider than Baloo. Curious, Seosu slipped into the thick forest nearby, but was stunned to see the fish scraps he'd left behind were now missing. Back at camp, Dongheng and another soldier were startled by the sight of a deer, but Dongheng assured his clean-shaven comrade to relax, saying it was just a harmless herbivore. However, the deer suddenly swung its large antlers from side to side and, without warning, charged straight at them. The driver, stunned, nearly wet himself and jammed his foot on the pedal to reverse. But before he could move, the massive deer rammed into the truck, scattering the soldiers across the ground. Seosu noticed the chaotic scene and watched, stunned, as the deer launched the truck into the air as if it were nothing more than dirty laundry. Up ahead, another large red deer appeared, and the soldiers in the front quickly exited the truck, aiming their machine guns at it. At the front, as the soldiers finally opened fire on the big red deer, it darted into the thick forest. Some soldiers prepared to pursue, but the lieutenant ordered them to stand down. Seosu's truck eventually caught up with the front group, and he noticed Seo-jin was strangely calm, not joining the others in shooting at the deer. Just then, a soldier called out to Seosu to treat a wounded comrade. Approaching the injured man, Seosu remarked that the wound was just a graze and told the soldier to stop crying as if his leg had been cut off. As the journey resumed, Saeksu and Dongwon climbed onto the back of the pickup truck. Just as Saeksu was about to climb in, he suddenly screamed in pain, his eyes turning bloodshot white. He collapsed to the ground, and when the lieutenant approached to check, he realized Saeksu was no longer breathing. The lieutenant asked what happened, and a terrified Donghang explained that they were climbing into the pickup truck when the man suddenly collapsed. Hearing this, the lieutenant scanned the dense forest, sensing that something sinister might be lurking in the shadows. A nervous soldier urged the group to turn back, saying the place felt eerie, but the lieutenant, with a stern look, reminded him they had strict orders to be there. Just then, Singshu approached and told the men to stop bickering like women and get moving. She instructed Seosu to carry the dead man to the back of the pickup truck and stay there. However, as Seosu examined the body, he noticed a poisonous dart lodged in the man's neck. Singshu snapped at him to follow her instructions, and they set off. Seosu sat at the back of the truck with the corpse, muttering to it that since they'd decided to put at the back of the truck, he would definitely finish the crackers. One soldier up front wondered who the heck the nutcase was talking to, while another commented on how hot it was getting despite the winter weather. They soon realized the heat was coming from the nearby volcanic mountains spewing magma. 2 days passed as they camped near the mountain Rongge. As they ventured deeper, a soldier pointed out an inscription on the mountainside that warned the living to stay out. The soldiers stared at the eerie words and asked Seosu who had carved them. Seosu replied that he had no idea since the last time he was there, he hadn't seen them. Suspicious, one soldier demanded to know why Seosu had ventured so far into the mountains and questioned if he was really who he claimed to be. With a smirk, Seosu admitted he'd been fooling them all along, joking that he was actually a descendant of the dragon. The lieutenant immediately pulled his gun, aiming it at Seosu, and demanded to know why he'd come this far and if he was responsible for the inscription. Seosu pointed out that the words were carved too high up for someone like him who had the same height with Kelvin Hart. Another soldier yelled, demanding an explanation for why he had come this deep into the mountains. Seosu revealed that a year before, he had been chased there by a pack of wolves. The soldier called him a disgusting liar, pressing him on how he had escaped. Seosu responded that he wasn't the wolves' target. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He recalled, in a flashback, that he had run into the forest in a panic, never expecting the wolves to follow. But when he reached the Howling Canyon, the wolves abruptly stopped their pursuit. This revelation left everyone stunned, and they murmured among themselves that if even the wolves had avoided that place, something far more dangerous might be there. Seosu added that he had hidden there for 2 days, and once the wolves left, he'd managed to escape. A frightened soldier then speculated that the inscription could have been carved by a supernatural being, but the lieutenant snapped at him to keep quiet, calling it a military secret. Frustrated, the soldier argued, questioning why the lieutenant was so devoted to orders, especially when they were all essentially cast out. Hearing this, Seosu realized the soldiers were there not for orders but for some ulterior motive. Just then, they heard a noise at the back of the truck, putting them on high alert. Moving stealthily to investigate, they found a black fluffy figure and opened fire. After several rounds, they realized it was just a black rat trying to steal food. But when they checked, the lieutenant was shocked to oblivion at seeing that all the food had disappeared. He yelled for Seosu, and as Seosu approached, both men were stunned to discover that Xiaxu's dead body was gone as well. What could have happened to Xiaxu's corpse? Comment Mind Pele's if you're eager to find out in our part 2. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As always, thanks for watching.